I'm Hazel Whitaker, 72, and for 37 years I've been living as the widow of a Chernobyl hero. My husband Robert died containing the disaster that could have killed millions, leaving me with nothing but grief and his reactor technicians' pension. But yesterday, his former supervisor knocked on my door with documents that shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband's sacrifice. The secret $5 million fund wasn't just compensation, it was something far more complex. And the truth about why Robert really stayed behind that night would change how I see our entire marriage. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever discovered that the person you loved most kept life-changing secrets, like this video, the man standing on my porch looked older than his 75 years. His weathered hands clutching a manila envelope with Soviet stamps still visible on the corners. Viktor Petrov had been Robert's supervisor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and I hadn't seen him since the memorial service in 1986. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said in heavily accented English, his voice trembling slightly, "I have come a very long way to see you. May I come in?" I stepped aside, noting how his eyes avoided mine. In my small living room, surrounded by the modest furniture I'd accumulated over decades of careful spending, Victor seemed like a ghost from another world. He set the sealed envelope on my coffee table, as if it contained explosives. "I have carried this burden for 37 years, he began, his fingers drumming nervously against his knee. "Your husband Robert, he was not just hero that night. He was part of something bigger, something the government kept secret even from families." My heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Victor opened the envelope with shaking hands, revealing official documents stamped with Soviet seals. There was fund compensation, fund for families of men who died that night. $5 million American dollars, set aside specifically for you. The room spun. $5 million. The number was incomprehensible. I thought of the years I'd worked 3 jobs, just to keep the lights on. The nights I'd gone to bed hungry so there would be food for the children. The medical bills I'd let pile up because I couldn't afford treatment. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I would have known. Someone would have told me." Victor's face crumpled with guilt. "The system was complicated, political. There were reasons. I am not proud of why some families received their money and others did not. But the money, it has been waiting all these years, growing with interest." "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Why are you telling me this now?" He pulled out a photograph of Robert, in his work clothes, standing beside other men I didn't recognize. "Because I am dying, Mrs. Whitaker, cancer. And I cannot meet my maker, knowing I kept this from you any longer." The weight of 37 years of unnecessary struggle crashed down on me. All those nights wondering how I'd pay rent, all the times I'd told my children we couldn't afford school trips or new clothes. All the years I'd lived on the edge of financial disaster, while $5 million sat in some account with my name on it. "There's more," Victor said softly. "The circumstances of Robert's death, they were more complicated than you were told. He knew about the fund. He made sure you would qualify before he made his final choice that night." My hands shook as I reached for the documents. "What choice? What are you talking about?" "Tomorrow," Victor said, standing slowly. "I will explain everything tomorrow, but tonight, you should rest. This is just the beginning of what you need to know." After he left, I sat in the growing darkness, staring at the papers spread across my coffee table. The official seals, the foreign words, the impossible numbers, they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. But Robert's name was there, spelled out in careful Cyrillic letters, and beside it, my own name as his beneficiary. I picked up the faded photograph Victor had left behind. Robert looked so young, so alive, standing with his colleagues in front of the reactor building. How had I never known there were others? How had I never known about the fund? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's face the morning he left for his final shift, the way he'd kissed my forehead and whispered that he loved me. Had he known then what was coming? Had he known he was walking toward $5 million and his death? I woke before dawn, as I had every day for 37 years, my body trained by decades of necessity. But this morning was different. Instead of immediately calculating whether I could afford coffee with breakfast, I found myself staring at the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter, a monument to my financial reality. The electricity bill was overdue by 3 weeks. The notice was printed on that particular shade of yellow that meant they were serious about disconnection. Beside it lay a medical bill from my last doctor's visit, the one where I'd finally admitted I couldn't afford the blood pressure medication he'd prescribed. The pharmacy had suggested a generic alternative, but even that stretched my budget. Beyond breaking, I made weak coffee 1 scoop instead of 2 and sat at the same kitchen table where Robert had eaten his last breakfast 37 years ago. The morning light caught the water stains on the ceiling, reminders of a roof I couldn't afford to fix properly. I'd learned to position pots and pans strategically during storms, turning our home into a percussion orchestra of survival. After Robert died, the Soviet government had provided what they called a hero's pension, a monthly payment that barely covered rent in our small apartment. When we immigrated to America in 1991, that pension disappeared entirely. I was 56 years old, speaking broken English, with no work experience outside of helping Robert with his technical drawings at home. My first job was cleaning offices at night. I'd take the bus across town at 10 p.m., work until 6 a.m., then rush home to get the children ready for school. I'd sleep for 3 hours, then work my second job, cashier, at a corner grocery store until the children came home. On weekends, I cleaned houses for wealthy families who paid in cash and didn't ask questions about work permits. The children never complained, but I saw the impact in their faces. My daughter Sarah learned to shop for bargains before she learned to read properly. My son Michael wore shoes with holes in them for an entire winter because I couldn't afford new ones. They grew up understanding that wanting and getting were different things entirely. I pulled out my worn address book and found the page where I'd tracked every job I'd ever held. 19 different employers over 37 years. Factory work, when my back was strong enough. Cleaning when it wasn't. Retail when I could stand for 8 hours straight. Each job paid just enough to keep us from homelessness. Never enough to build anything resembling security. The neighbors meant well, but their pity stung. Mrs. Chen next door regularly appeared with casseroles and gentle inquiries about my health. The Johnsons across the street had quietly paid for Michael's school lunch program, 1 year without telling me until months later. Their kindness was genuine, but it reinforced how visible my struggle had become. I'd developed a careful mathematics of survival. Generic cereal instead of name brand saved $12 a month. Walking to the grocery store instead of driving saved gas money. Keeping the thermostat at 62 degrees in winter meant I could afford to keep the heat on at all. These calculations had become so automatic that I performed them without thinking. A mental spreadsheet constantly running in the background of my life. The stack of bills seemed to mock me as I sat there, remembering Victor's words about $5 million. $5 million more money than I'd earned in my entire lifetime. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having. I tried to imagine what that amount of money looked like, what it would feel like to pay every bill without checking my bank balance first. My arthritis was acting up again, the familiar ache in my knuckles that came with weather changes. I'd learned to live with the pain rather than spend money on expensive anti-inflammatory medication. The doctor had mentioned surgery once, but the cost was astronomical. I'd simply nodded and changed the subject. I thought about the grandchildren I saw only on holidays because I couldn't afford to visit more often. The birthday gifts I'd made by hand because store-bought ones were too expensive. The family gatherings I'd missed because I was working, always working, trying to stay ahead of the bills that seemed to multiply like living things. The morning sun grew stronger, illuminating the careful repairs I'd made to our furniture over the years. Tape on the sofa arm where the fabric had worn through. A table leg propped up with folded cardboard. The television that required a specific angle to receive clear picture. These weren't just objects, they were evidence of a life lived on the margins, where everything was temporary and nothing was replaceable. If Victor was telling the truth, if there really was $5 million waiting for me, then every sacrifice had been unnecessary. Every night I'd gone to bed hungry. Every winter we'd shivered to save on heating bills. Every medical treatment I'd postponed. All of it could have been avoided if someone had simply told me the truth 37 years ago. I found myself drawn to the bedroom dresser, where our wedding photograph sat in its cracked frame, another casualty of our years of careful living. The crack ran diagonally across the glass, bisecting our younger selves, but I'd never had the money to replace it. Now, looking at Robert's face in that faded image, I wondered what else had been broken that I'd never been able to fix. We met, in 1973, at a community dance in Pripyat, when the city was still young and full of promise. Robert was 28. Already working at the nuclear plant. and I was 25, teaching elementary school in town. He was quieter than the other men, more thoughtful. While they told jokes and showed off, Robert asked me about my students, about the books I was reading, about my dreams for the future. "You're different," I told him after our third dance, when he'd walked me to the refreshment table and bought me a glass of punch. "Different how?" he asked, his dark eyes serious. "You listen when I talk. Most men are just waiting for their turn to speak." He smiled, that small, careful smile that would become so familiar over the years. My mother always said the wisest person in any room is usually the one talking least. We courted for 18 months, long walks through Pripyat's tree-lined streets, weekend picnics by the Pripyat River, quiet evenings in my small apartment where he'd help me grade papers while I mended his work clothes. He was methodical in everything: his courtship, his work, his plans for our future. When he proposed, it was with a ring he'd saved for 6 months to buy, presented after a dinner he'd cooked himself because he wanted everything to be perfect. Our wedding was small, but joyful, held in the community center with 40 guests and a cake my mother had made. Robert's parents had died in a car accident when he was 22, so my family became his family. He fit into our chaotic household like a missing puzzle piece, bringing calm and stability to our emotional storms. The early years of our marriage were simple and sweet. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment near the plant, close enough that Robert could walk to work. I continued teaching until Sarah was born in 1976. Then again, after Michael arrived in 1978, Robert was a devoted father, patient with the children's questions, always ready with a bedtime story or help with homework. He rarely talked about his work in detail, but I knew he was respected at the plant. His colleagues would stop him on the street to ask technical questions, and his supervisors frequently requested his opinion on complex problems. He had a gift for understanding systems, for seeing how all the pieces fit together. "Nuclear power is like a very large, very complicated recipe," he once explained to Michael, who was struggling with a science project. "Every ingredient must be measured precisely, every step must be followed exactly, or the whole thing fails. But when it works correctly, it can power an entire city." Robert approached our marriage the same way he approached his work, with careful attention to detail and absolute commitment. He never forgot an anniversary or birthday. He fixed things before they broke. He planned for contingencies I never would have considered. When I had pneumonia in 1982, he took 2 weeks off work to care for me and the children, something that was almost unheard of at the plant. I remembered our last anniversary, just 6 weeks before the accident. Robert had surprised me with dinner at the nicest restaurant in Pripyat, a place we rarely could afford. He'd been quieter than usual, more thoughtful, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of the evening. "Are you happy, Hazel?" he asked over dessert, reaching across the table to take my hand. "Of course I'm happy. Why would you ask that?" "I just want to make sure. I want to know that whatever happens, you know how much I love you." The question had seemed odd at the time, but Robert was always prone to philosophical moments. I'd squeezed his hand and changed the subject, never imagining those words would echo in my mind for decades to come. The night before the accident, he'd been restless. I'd found him sitting at our kitchen table at 2 a.m., staring at a cup of cold tea, lost in thought. "Can't sleep?" I'd asked, sitting beside him. "Just thinking about work." There are some things, he'd paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some things that concern me. Safety protocols that could be better. Have you talked to your supervisors about it?" He'd nodded slowly. "I've tried, but sometimes the bureaucracy makes it difficult to implement changes quickly." I'd rubbed his shoulders, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You're a good man, Robert. You always do what's right." "I hope so," he'd said quietly. "I hope history will judge me that way." The morning of April 26, 1986, he'd kissed me goodbye as always, but he'd held me longer than usual. His final words were simple: "I love you, Hazel. Remember that, no matter what happens." I'd assumed he was being overly romantic, perhaps still thinking about our anniversary dinner. I'd kissed him back and reminded him to eat the lunch I'd packed. I'd watched him walk down the street toward the plant, his familiar gait steady and purposeful. I never saw him alive again. Now, 37 years later, I found myself studying that wedding photograph with new eyes. Had Robert known something, even then? Had he always carried the weight of knowledge I couldn't share? The young man in the picture looked so confident, so certain of the future we were building together. But there was something in his eyes, a depth I hadn't noticed before. A sense of responsibility that went beyond our small family. The crack in the glass seemed prophetic now, a physical manifestation of all the things that had been broken by time and circumstances beyond our control. But even cracked, even faded, the love in that photograph was undeniable. Whatever secrets Robert had kept, whatever complexities Victor was about to reveal, I knew that love had been real. April 26, 1986. The date was burned into my memory like a brand, marking the moment my life divided into before and after. I could still recall every detail of that morning, the way the spring sunlight streamed through our bedroom window, the sound of Robert's electric shaver humming in the bathroom, the smell of the coffee I'd made too strong because I was distracted by Sarah's upcoming school play. Robert had left for work at his usual time, 7:30 a.m., carrying the lunch I'd packed and wearing his favorite blue shirt. He'd kissed my forehead and told me he loved me, just as he did every morning. There had been nothing unusual about his departure, nothing to suggest I was watching him walk away for the last time. The day had unfolded normally. I'd taken the children to school, stopped at the market for groceries, spent the afternoon preparing for Sarah's play rehearsal. It was a Saturday, so Robert would normally have been home by 3 p.m. When 4 o'clock came and went without him, I felt the first flutter of concern. By 5 p.m., I was worried. Robert was never late without calling. He was methodical about time, respectful of my need to know when to expect him. I'd tried calling the plant's main number, but the line was busy. I'd assumed there was some kind of maintenance issue, nothing unusual for a nuclear facility. At 6:30, the phone finally rang. Robert's voice was tense, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "Hazel, there's been an incident at the plant. I need to stay and help with the emergency response." "What kind of incident, are you safe?" "There was an explosion in reactor 4. We're working to contain the situation. I don't know when I'll be home." My heart had stopped. An explosion. "Robert, you need to come home now. Get out of there." "I can't, Hazel. You don't understand. If we don't stop this now, if we don't contain the radiation, it could spread for hundreds of miles. Millions of people could be affected. But what about us? What about the children?" There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more personal. "I need you to pack a bag for yourself and the children. Just essentials. Take them to your mother's house in Kiev tonight." "Robert, you're scaring me." "I'm sorry, my love. I'm so sorry, but I need you to trust me. Pack your things and leave Pripyat tonight. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving without you. You have to." His voice cracked slightly. "Hazel, I need you to know if something happens to me, if I don't make it home, you and the children will be taken care of. I've made arrangements. There are people who will help you." "What arrangements? What are you talking about?" "I can't explain now. Just remember that I love you more than anything in this world. You and the children are my whole life. Whatever happens, never forget that." The line went dead. I'd stood there, holding the phone, my hands shaking, trying to process what I'd heard. An explosion at the plant. Radiation. Millions of people at risk. And Robert, my careful, methodical Robert, choosing to stay and fight whatever was happening instead of coming home to safety. I'd packed quickly, throwing clothes and documents into suitcases while the children asked questions I couldn't answer. Sarah, 10 years old, had sensed my panic and started crying. Michael, 8, had demanded to know where his father was. I'd told them we were visiting Grandma, that Daddy would meet us there soon. On the kitchen table, I'd found a hastily written note in Robert's careful handwriting. "My dearest Hazel, if you are reading this, then I have been called to duty. I love you and the children more than life itself. Trust Viktor Petrov. He will help you understand. Take care of our family. I will love you forever." Robert, the note had been written on a piece of paper torn from his work notebook. The edges rough and hurried. Even in crisis, even facing whatever disaster was unfolding at the plant, he'd thought of me, thought of our future. We'd left Pripyat that night, joining a stream of families fleeing the city. The children had fallen asleep in the back of our neighbor's car, exhausted by the confusion and fear. I'd stared out the window at the glow on the horizon, a strange, unnatural light that seemed to pulse against the dark sky. 3 days later, Viktor Petrov had appeared at my mother's house in Kiev, his face gray with exhaustion and grief. He'd sat in my mother's parlor, hat in his hands, and told me that Robert was dead. that he'd been part of a team that had prevented a much larger disaster, but that the radiation exposure had been fatal. He was a hero, Victor had said, his voice thick with emotion. He saved thousands of lives, maybe millions. He knew the risks, but he stayed anyway. Why? I'd asked through my tears. Why did he have to stay? Why couldn't someone else? Because he understood the systems better than anyone, because he knew exactly what needed to be done, and because Victor had paused, looking uncomfortable, because he wanted to ensure that his family would be provided for. There are protocols, arrangements for families of men who make the ultimate sacrifice. I'd been too grief-stricken to ask what he meant by arrangements, too overwhelmed by the magnitude of losing Robert to process anything beyond the immediate pain. The Soviet government had provided a hero's pension and a medal, and I'd assumed that was what Victor had been referring to. Now, 37 years later, I understood that Victor had been trying to tell me something much more significant. Robert's final note, "Trust Viktor Petrov, he will help you understand," hadn't been about understanding his death. It had been about understanding the financial arrangements he'd made, the secret fund that would ensure our survival. But Victor had failed to explain, the system had failed to notify me. And I'd spent 37 years believing that Robert's heroism had been rewarded with nothing more than a small pension and a medal I kept in a drawer. The worst part was the realization that Robert had known. He'd known about the fund, known that his sacrifice would be compensated, known that his family would be financially secure. He'd died believing that his widow would receive $5 million, that his children would have opportunities he'd never been able to provide. Instead, I'd struggled in poverty while his sacrifice went unrecognized and his family's future went unfulfilled. The system had failed him as completely as it had failed me. Victor returned the next morning carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than the Soviet Union itself. His face was drawn, and I could see the weight of 37 years of guilt etched in every line around his eyes. He set the briefcase on my kitchen table with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. "Mrs. Whitaker," he began, his voice steadier than the day before, "what I am about to show you will be difficult to understand. The Soviet system was complex, often contradictory. What seemed like bureaucratic failure was sometimes deliberate policy." He opened the briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with official stamps and Cyrillic text. The classified Soviet report was bound in red cloth, its pages yellowed with age but still bearing the unmistakable authority of government documentation. "This is the official report on the Chernobyl Disaster Compensation Fund," Victor explained, translating as he turned the pages. "Established 3 months after the accident by direct order of the fund was created specifically for families of the men who died containing the disaster." I studied the document, noting Robert's name listed among 31 others. Each name was followed by a monetary amount, some smaller, some larger, but all substantial. Robert's entry showed the largest sum, $5 million American dollars. "Why so much for Robert?" I asked. Victor's face darkened. Because he was not just a technician that night, he was the senior engineer who understood the reactor's cooling systems better than anyone else. When the explosion occurred, the automatic safety systems failed. Someone had to manually operate the emergency cooling pumps to prevent the remaining 3 reactors from also exploding. He pulled out a technical diagram, pointing to various components. If those 3 reactors had failed, the radiation release would have been 50 times worse. Most of Ukraine would be uninhabitable today. Millions would have died. And Robert did this alone? No. He led a team of 12 men into the reactor building. They knew it was a suicide mission. The radiation levels were lethal within minutes, but they also knew that someone had to do it, and Robert was the only one who fully understood the systems. Victor turned to another page in the report, revealing photographs I'd never seen before. Robert in his radiation suit, standing with his team before they entered the reactor building. The men looked calm, determined, as if they were going to work rather than to their deaths. The fund was structured differently for each family based on the specific contribution of their loved one. Robert's leadership in that critical moment saved millions of lives. The government recognized this by allocating the maximum compensation. "But I never received anything," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Victor nodded grimly. "This is where the system failed you. The fund required specific documentation, proof of marriage, proof of Soviet citizenship, proof of residency in Pripyat. When you fled to Kiev after the accident, then immigrated to America in 1991, The bureaucracy lost track of you. He showed me another section of the report, pointing to administrative notes in the margins. Your file was marked as status unknown in 1987. By 1990, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, many records were lost or destroyed. The fund administrators assumed you had died or could not be located. But you knew where I was. You could have found me. Victor's shame was palpable. I tried, Mrs. Whitaker. In 1992, I wrote letters to immigration offices in America, trying to trace you, but I was just a retired plant supervisor. I had no official authority, no resources. The new Ukrainian government was struggling to exist. They had no interest in honoring Soviet financial obligations. He reached into the briefcase again and withdrew a stack of bank statements. The money was never distributed to other families. It remained in a special account, managed by a Swiss bank that specialized in handling Soviet assets. Over 37 years, with compound interest, the $5 million has grown to nearly $12 million. The numbers were incomprehensible. $12 million, while I'd counted pennies at the grocery store. While I'd worked 3 jobs just to keep our apartment. While my children had worn secondhand clothes and gone without so many things they wanted. $12 million had been sitting in a Swiss bank account with my name on it. The other families, I asked, did they receive their compensation? Victor nodded sadly. Most of them, yes. The families who remained in Ukraine, who stayed within the Soviet system, they were contacted within 2 years of the accident. They received their funds and were able to rebuild their lives. He showed me a list of the other families, with dates indicating when they'd received their compensation. Some had used the money to relocate to other countries. Others had started businesses or bought homes. All had been able to honor their loved ones' sacrifices while building stable futures. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why wait 37 years? Victor closed the briefcase and looked directly at me. Because I am dying, Mrs. Whitaker, lung cancer from radiation exposure. The doctors give me perhaps 6 months. I have spent decades carrying the guilt of your family's suffering, knowing that I could have tried harder to find you, that I could have fought the bureaucracy more aggressively. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. This is the lawyer who has been managing the fund for the past 15 years. He has been waiting for someone to come forward with legitimate claim to Robert's compensation. He has all the documentation needed to transfer the money to you. It's really that simple. The legal process will take some time, perhaps 6 months, to verify your identity and process the claim. But yes, Mrs. Whitaker, the money is yours. It has always been yours. Robert died believing that you would receive it, that his sacrifice would ensure your family's security. I stared at the business card, at the name of a lawyer I'd never heard of, in a country I'd never visited. What would Robert want me to do with it? Victor smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. He would want you to live, Mrs. Whitaker. He would want you to finally stop struggling, to finally have the security he tried to provide. And he would want you to remember him, not just as the man who died at Chernobyl, but as the husband who loved you enough to sacrifice everything to protect your future. Victor spread dozens of documents across my kitchen table, each one bearing multiple stamps, signatures, and official seals that looked like hieroglyphics to my untrained eyes. The stamp-covered application forms told a story of bureaucratic complexity that would have been comedic if it hadn't cost me 37 years of financial security. The Soviet compensation system was designed by committees, Victor explained, organizing the papers into different piles. Each committee had different requirements, different classifications, different approval processes. A family could qualify under one set of criteria but be disqualified under another. He pointed to a form labeled Application for Emergency Compensation Form 447B. The document was entirely in Russian, covered with stamps from various government departments. This was the primary application that had to be filed within 6 months of the incident. But there was also Form 447C for families who evacuated the immediate area, and Form 447D for families who relocated outside the Soviet Union. Which form was I supposed to file? That's where the system failed you. Because you fled Pripyat immediately, then moved to Kiev, then immigrated to America. You technically fell under all 3 categories, but no single office was authorized to approve applications that crossed multiple jurisdictions. Victor showed me another stack of documents, correspondence between various Soviet ministries arguing about which department should handle my case. The letters, dated between 1987 and 1991, revealed a system paralyzed by its own complexity. The Ministry of Nuclear Energy said compensation should come from the Ministry of Emergency Situations. The Ministry of Emergency Situations said it was a matter for the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance said families who emigrated fell under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Each ministry had passed my file to another department, creating a paper trail that led nowhere. By 1990, my file had been transferred 17 times between different offices, none of which felt authorized to make a final decision. What about the other families? How did they navigate this maze? Victor pulled out a different set of documents. The families who received compensation had one thing in common: they remained in the same location and maintained their Soviet citizenship. The system worked for people who fit neatly into its categories. He showed me the successful applications, each one straightforward and processed within 18 months. The families had provided the required documentation, remained in contact with local authorities, and followed up regularly on their applications. But I was caring for 2 children in a foreign country, I protested. I was learning English, trying to find work, trying to build a new life. I didn't have time to navigate Soviet bureaucracy from America. The system assumed families would remain in the Soviet sphere of influence, Victor acknowledged. It was not designed for the massive emigration that occurred after the disaster. Thousands of families fled the region, but most stayed within Soviet territory. You were one of the few who left entirely. He showed me a map marking the locations of all 31 families. Most had relocated within Ukraine or to other Soviet republics. Only 3 families had emigrated to Western countries, and of those, only 1 mine had never received compensation. The other 2 emigrant families hired lawyers immediately, Victor explained. They understood that crossing international boundaries would complicate their claims. They maintained contact with Soviet authorities and fought the bureaucracy from the beginning. No one ever told me I needed a lawyer. No one explained the process. Victor nodded sadly. This is my greatest failure. As Robert's supervisor, I should have guided you through the system. I should have explained the requirements, helped you file the correct forms, advocated for your case when it got lost in the bureaucracy. He pulled out his personal notes from 1986, handwritten reminders to contact the families of his fallen colleagues. My name appeared on the list, but there were no check marks beside it, no indication that he'd followed through. I made initial contact with most families within 3 months of the accident, but by the time I tried to reach you, you had already left Kiev. Your mother gave me your address in America, but international communication was limited then. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. The few letters Victor had sent to my early addresses in America had been returned as undeliverable. Immigration officials weren't required to forward mail, and our frequent moves during those early years meant we rarely stayed at the same address long enough to establish reliable mail service. The bank that managed the fund sent notices to your last known address in Pripyat for 5 years, Victor continued. When those were returned, they sent notices to the Soviet embassy in Washington, but the embassy fell during the Soviet collapse in 1991, and all records were transferred to the new Ukrainian embassy, where they were lost in the transition. Victor showed me copies of those returned notices, official letters informing me of my eligibility for compensation, my right to claim the funds, the required documentation to process my application. All of them had been marked returned to send unknown. By 1995, the bank was required by international law to classify unclaimed funds as dormant assets. Your money was placed in a special account that could only be accessed if you came forward with proper documentation proving your identity and your husband's death. And no one thought to publish a list of unclaimed funds. No one tried to locate missing families through international channels. Victor's expression grew even more pained. Mrs. Whitaker, you must understand, the Soviet Union was collapsing. Ukraine was fighting for its independence. Russia was in chaos. Publishing lists of secret compensation funds would have created international incidents. The new governments wanted to distance themselves from Soviet-era obligations. He showed me newspaper clippings from the 1990s. Headlines about Ukrainian efforts to shed Soviet legacy programs. Compensation funds for Chernobyl victims were politically sensitive. Reminders of Soviet nuclear failures that the new government preferred to forget. Your file was transferred to the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice in 1993, then to a private law firm in 1998, then to the Swiss bank in 2005. Each transfer increased the complexity of claiming the funds, but also increased the security protecting them. The final stack of documents showed the current status of the fund, now managed by a prestigious Swiss law firm specializing in dormant assets and unclaimed inheritances. The firm had been actively seeking legitimate claimants since 2010, but their search had focused on European records, not American immigration files. Victor reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew something that made my breath catch. Pages from a journal, the handwriting unmistakably Robert's. The hidden journal pages were water-stained and yellowed, but the words were still legible, written in Robert's careful script. "I found these in his work locker after the accident," Victor said quietly. "I should have given them to you years ago, but I was afraid they would cause you more pain. Now I think you deserve to know the truth about your husband's final months." The first page was dated January 15, 1986, more than 3 months before the disaster. Robert's words revealed a man increasingly troubled by what he was seeing at the plant. Another safety test postponed due to political pressure. The reactor design has flaws that management refuses to acknowledge. I have submitted 3 separate reports recommending immediate modifications to the cooling system. Each report has been rejected as unnecessarily cautious and economically unfeasible. But the mathematics don't launder certain conditions. This reactor could become unstable. I had never known Robert kept a journal. In all our years of marriage, I'd never seen him write anything beyond technical reports and grocery lists. But here was evidence of a private intellectual life, a space where he grappled with concerns he couldn't share with me. The entry from February 8 was even more troubling. Attended a classified briefing today about reactor safety protocols. The engineers from Moscow continue to insist that our concerns are theoretical, that the RBMK reactor design is inherently safe, but they have never worked hands-on with these systems. They don't understand how quickly things can cascade out of control. I feel like Cassandra cursed to see the truth but powerless to convince anyone to listen. Victor watched my face as I read. "Your husband was one of the most knowledgeable reactor engineers in the entire Soviet nuclear program. His understanding of the systems was exceptional, almost intuitive. But that knowledge became a burden when he realized how dangerous the situation was becoming." The entry from March 20 revealed the depth of Robert's moral struggle. Had another argument with supervisory engineer Foreman today about the upcoming turbine test. He insists we can run the test with reduced safety margins to meet the political deadline. I told him the test should be postponed until we can implement proper safety protocols. He accused me of being overly cautious, of putting engineering perfectionism ahead of practical needs. But what is the value of meeting a deadline if it means risking catastrophic failure? I looked up at Victor. "Did you know about these concerns? Did other people share Robert's fears?" "Some of us suspected there were problems," Victor admitted. But Robert was the only one with the technical expertise to fully understand the implications. The rest of us were technicians following procedures. Robert understood the science behind the procedures. The entry from April 10, just 16 days before the disaster, was prophetic. The turbine test has been rescheduled for April 25. Despite my objections, management has decided to proceed with reduced safety protocols. I have documented my concerns in writing and submitted them to the appropriate authorities. If something goes wrong, at least there will be a record that we tried to prevent it. But I fear my warnings will be ignored until it's too late. Victor pointed to a notation in the margin of that entry. "Hazel must never know about this unless something happens to me. She would worry herself sick, and there's nothing she could do to change the situation." Even in his private thoughts, Robert had been protecting me from knowledge that would have terrified me. He'd carried the weight of his concerns alone, never sharing his fears about the plant's safety because he didn't want to burden me with worries I couldn't address. The final entry was dated April 25, 1986, the day before the accident. "The test is scheduled for tonight. I have requested permission to oversee the safety protocols personally, despite this being outside my normal duties. Management has agreed, perhaps hoping my presence will alleviate some of the technical concerns I've raised. I pray that my fears are unfounded, that the test will proceed without incident. But if something does go wrong, I want to be there to minimize the damage. Hazel and the children deserve a world where nuclear energy is used safely, not recklessly." Beneath that entry, in handwriting that looked more hurried, was a final note. "If anyone reads this after my death, know that I chose to stay not out of heroism, but out of responsibility. I helped create this situation through my silence when I should have fought harder against unsafe procedures. If my death can prevent a larger catastrophe, then perhaps some good can come from my failures. The fund has been established to care for the families. Hazel must receive her portion. This is not negotiable. I set the pages down with trembling hands. He knew the test was dangerous, and he participated anyway. He participated because he was the only one qualified to make it as safe as possible. Victor corrected. Robert could have refused the assignment. He could have called in sick, could have found an excuse to be anywhere else that night. Instead, he volunteered to oversee the safety protocols because he knew his expertise gave the test the best chance of success. Victor pulled out another document, Robert's formal request to supervise the turbine test. The request was submitted on April 24th, just one day before the disaster, and included a detailed list of additional safety measures Robert wanted to implement. When the reactor became unstable during the test, Robert was the first to recognize what was happening. His journal shows he'd been studying this exact scenario for months. When the explosion occurred, he immediately knew what needed to be done to prevent a much larger disaster. But why didn't he evacuate with the others? Victor's voice became very quiet because he was the only one who understood the cooling system well enough to operate it manually. The automatic systems had failed. Someone had to go into the reactor building and physically operate the emergency pumps. It was a death sentence, but it was also the only way to prevent the remaining 3 reactors from also exploding. I thought about the note Robert had left on our kitchen table. Trust Viktor Petrov. He will help you understand. Now, I understood that Robert hadn't just been referring to the compensation fund. He'd been asking Victor to help me understand that his death wasn't a random tragedy, but the result of a calculated decision to take responsibility for a situation he'd helped create through his professional silence. The fund wasn't just compensation for his death. I realized it was Robert's way of ensuring that his family would benefit from his professional knowledge, even after he was gone. Victor nodded. Robert spent his final hours not just saving millions of lives, but also ensuring that his wife and children would have financial security. He understood both the technical systems that needed to be saved and the bureaucratic systems that could provide for his family's future. Victor carefully unfolded a large group photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. The picture showed all 31 men who died at Chernobyl that night, taken just weeks before the disaster at a plant safety meeting. Robert stood in the back row, his serious expression now taking on new meaning as I understood the weight of knowledge he'd been carrying. These were not just random victims, Victor explained, pointing to different faces in the photograph. Each of these men made a conscious choice to stay and fight the disaster. Each left behind a family that deserved to understand their sacrifice. He began telling me about the other families, starting with Mikhail Petrov's relation. Despite sharing Victor's surname, Mikhail had been a young reactor operator, only 24, married just 6 months before the accident. His widow, Anya, received her compensation in 1988, Victor said, $2 million. She used it to move to Canada, where she started a foundation for nuclear safety education. She remarried eventually, had children, but she never forgot Mikhail's sacrifice. Victor showed me a newspaper clipping about Anya's foundation, a photograph of an elegant woman cutting a ribbon at a nuclear safety training center. The caption identified her as Dr. Anya Petrovchin, director of the International Nuclear Safety Institute. She was able to turn her grief into purpose, Victor continued. The compensation allowed her to get an education, to become an expert in the field that claimed her husband's life. Now she trains reactor operators around the world, making sure they understand the lessons of Chernobyl. The next story was about the Volkov family. Boris Volkov had been a senior engineer, 43 years old, with 3 teenage children. His wife Svetlana had received $4 million in compensation and had used it to ensure her children could attend university anywhere in the world. All 3 children became engineers, Victor said, showing me graduation photos. One works for the International Atomic Energy Agency, one designs wind turbines, and one specializes in nuclear waste disposal. They've dedicated their careers to making energy safer. Victor pulled out letters correspondence he'd maintained with many of the families over the years. The letters revealed a network of people connected by tragedy, but empowered by the compensation to build meaningful lives. The Kozlov family used their compensation to start a medical research foundation focused on radiation treatment, Victor explained. They've funded clinics in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia that provide free care to radiation exposure victims. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes: education, purpose, and the ability to honor their loved ones' sacrifices through meaningful action. The compensation hadn't just provided financial security, it had given these families the freedom to choose how to spend their lives, rather than simply surviving from day to day. What about the families who stayed in Ukraine? I asked. Victor's expression grew more complex. Those stories are more difficult. The families who remained within the Soviet system received their compensation, but they also faced different challenges. He showed me a letter from Maria Davydenko, whose husband had been the plant's safety engineer. Maria received $3 million, but she chose to stay in Pripyat after it was declared safe for limited habitation. She used her money to become one of the few permanent residents of the exclusion zone. Documenting the environmental recovery for scientific research, the letter was dated just 2 months ago, written by a woman now in her 70s who had spent 37 years living alone in a ghost city, funded by her husband's sacrifice to bear witness to the land's slow healing. Some families were destroyed by the compensation, Victor admitted. The Federal family received their money in 1989, but the widow remarried a man who squandered it all on failed business ventures. She died in poverty 10 years later, despite having received $2.5 million. He showed me official documents about families who had lost their compensation to bad investments, family disputes, or simple mismanagement. The money had been life-changing for those who used it wisely, but devastating for those who weren't prepared for sudden wealth. This is why Robert specified such detailed instructions for your compensation, Victor explained. He understood that receiving a large sum suddenly could be as dangerous as never receiving it at all. He wanted safeguards in place to protect you and the children. Victor showed me Robert's original application for compensation, which included specific instructions for how the money should be managed. Robert had requested that the funds be placed in a managed account with professional oversight, ensuring that the money would grow over time and be protected from impulsive decisions. He also specified that you should receive regular contact from the fund administrators, Victor said, not just to manage the money, but to connect you with other families who had shared the experience. He wanted you to have support, to understand that you weren't alone. The photograph of all 31 men took on deeper meaning as Victor shared these stories. These weren't just faces in a group photo. They were husbands and fathers who had made calculations about how their deaths could best serve their families' futures. Robert knew about the other families' circumstances, Victor continued. He knew that some had extended family support, that others had professional skills that would help them navigate the compensation process. He also knew that you would be more isolated, more vulnerable to bureaucratic failures. Is that why his compensation was the largest? Victor nodded. Partially, but also because his role that night was the most critical. Without Robert's manual operation of the cooling systems, the disaster would have been exponentially worse. The compensation reflected both his sacrifice and his impact. Victor handed me addresses and phone numbers for several of the other families who were still alive and in contact with him. They have asked to meet you, if you're interested. They've wondered for decades what happened to Robert Whitaker's widow. Some of them even contributed money to organizations that were searching for you. I stared at the list of names and numbers, realizing that while I'd spent 37 years feeling alone and forgotten, there had been a community of people who remembered Robert's sacrifice and wondered about our fate. People who had built foundations and institutions and careers on the same tragedy that had left me struggling to pay rent. They're not just fellow widows, Victor explained. They're a family, bound together by an experience that no one else can truly understand. They've supported each other through remarriages, children's educations, health crises, and the complex emotions of building happy lives from terrible loss. For the first time since Victor had knocked on my door, I felt something other than shock or anger. I felt a longing to connect with people who truly understood what I'd experienced, who had faced the same challenge of honoring a heroic death while building a practical future. Victor opened a manila folder, thick with bank transfer records, each page bearing official stamps and signatures that traced the journey of Robert's compensation through nearly 4 decades of financial institutions. The documents told a story more complex than simple bureaucratic failure. They revealed a sophisticated system designed to protect funds from political instability while ensuring legitimate claims could eventually be honored. The initial $5 million was transferred from the Soviet State Bank to Credit Suisse in Geneva on December 15, 1986, Victor explained, pointing to the first transfer record. This was done to protect the funds from the political upheaval that Soviet leaders already anticipated. The transfer documentation was impressive in its thoroughness. Each page bore multiple signatures, authentication seals, and detailed instructions for fund management. The Soviet government, despite its many failures, had understood that compensation for Chernobyl victims needed to be protected from the regime changes that might follow the disaster. The Swiss bank was instructed to invest the funds conservatively and maintain detailed records of all transactions, Victor continued, showing me quarterly statements dating back to 1987. The goal was steady growth while preserving the principle for legitimate claimants. The bank statements revealed a methodical approach to wealth management. The initial $5 million had been invested in government bonds, blue-chip stocks, and real estate investments across multiple countries. The diversification strategy had protected the funds through various economic crises while generating steady returns. By 1995, your compensation had grown to $7.2 million, Victor said, pointing to a year-end statement. By 2005, it was $9.8 million. Today, the total value is $11.7 million. I tried to process these numbers, but they felt abstract, like discussing the distance to other planets. $11.7 million more money than most people could imagine, let alone one woman who had spent decades worrying about grocery bills. Victor showed me detailed investment records, explaining how the money had been managed by a series of increasingly sophisticated financial institutions. In 1998, Credit Suisse transferred management to a specialized division that handles dormant assets and unclaimed inheritances. This division has experienced reuniting families with lost funds from various political and economic disasters. The paper trail revealed multiple attempts to locate me over the years. In 1992, the bank had hired a private investigation firm to search for Robert's family. The investigators had traced our immigration to America but had lost the trail when we moved from our initial refugee placement in Chicago to our eventual home in a smaller town. The search was complicated by name changes and record-keeping problems, Victor explained. When you immigrated, your name was transliterated from Cyrillic differently on various documents. Sometimes you were listed as Hazel Whitaker, sometimes as Hazel Whitaker, sometimes as Hazel Whitaker. The bank records showed payments to investigation firms. In 1992, 1998, 2003, and 2010, each search had identified possible matches but had failed to make definitive contact. The most recent search, conducted by a firm specializing in Holocaust and political refugee asset recovery, had actually located my correct address but had sent notification letters that I'd never received. What happened to those letters? Victor showed me return receipts from the Postal Service. They were sent via registered mail to your address, but the delivery attempts were made during weekday business hours when you were at work. After 3 failed delivery attempts, the letters were returned to the bank as undeliverable. The irony was crushing. While I'd been working multiple jobs to survive, registered letters containing information about $11 million had been sitting at the post office, waiting for a signature. I'd been too busy earning minimum wage to provide. The bank's protocol required them to make contact attempts every 5 years, Victor explained. But each failed attempt reset the clock, meaning they would wait another 5 years before trying again. Victor showed me the bank's internal memos discussing my case. The language was formal and bureaucratic, but it revealed genuine concern about locating Robert's family. The bank managers understood the significance of the compensation and had allocated substantial resources to finding legitimate claimants. In 2015, the bank hired a genealogy firm that specializes in tracing Eastern European refugees. Victor said, "This firm actually identified your children's addresses and sent letters to them as well." My children received letters about this. Victor nodded gravely. Sarah received a letter at her home in Seattle in 2016. Michael received one at his address in Denver. But the letters were written in formal legal language and claimed to be from a Swiss bank regarding potential inheritance matters related to Soviet-era compensation funds. Both of your children assumed the letters were scams and threw them away. I thought about my children's reaction to such letters. They'd grown up watching me struggle financially, working multiple jobs, living paycheck to paycheck. The idea that their mother might be entitled to millions of dollars from a Swiss bank would have seemed like an obvious fraud attempt. The bank maintains detailed records of all contact attempts, Victor continued, showing me a thick file of returned letters, private investigator reports, and genealogy research. They have spent more than $200,000 over the years trying to locate you and your family. The most recent bank statement showed the current value of the compensation, $11,734,892.47. The precise accounting included details about management fees, investment gains and losses, currency fluctuation adjustments, and administrative costs. Despite the substantial search expenses, the fund had grown dramatically over nearly 4 decades. What happens to the money if I hadn't been found? I asked. Victor showed me the original fund documentation. After 50 years, unclaimed funds would be transferred to a charitable foundation focused on nuclear safety and victim assistance. But the bank was required to continue search efforts until that deadline, so they had 13 more years to find me. Yes, but Victor paused, looking uncomfortable. There's something else you should know. The Swiss bank is currently under investigation by international authorities for its handling of dormant assets. There's political pressure to resolve all outstanding claims quickly, before new regulations make the process more complicated. He showed me news articles about Swiss banking reforms, international pressure to return unclaimed assets to their rightful owners, and legal challenges to traditional banking secrecy laws. The political climate was pushing banks to resolve legacy cases, rather than continue managing them indefinitely. This investigation is actually why I was able to locate you, Victor admitted. The bank hired a new firm that specializes in urgent asset recovery. This firm used advanced database searches and cross-referenced immigration records with social media profiles. They found your address within 6 months. The timing was fortunate but troubling. If not for international political pressure on Swiss banks, I might have remained undiscovered until the 50-year deadline, at which point the money would have been lost forever. Victor handed me a business card that looked like it had been printed on expensive paper, the kind that whispered of serious money and international connections. The card belonged to Dr. Heinrich Müller, a lawyer specializing in international asset recovery, based in Geneva, with offices in Kiev, Moscow, and New York. Dr. Müller has been handling dormant Soviet-era compensation funds for 15 years, Victor explained. He understands both the legal complexities and the emotional impact of these cases. But I must warn you, the process will not be simple. I studied the card, noting the multiple phone numbers and the impressive list of credentials printed in small text at the bottom. What kind of complications are we talking about? Victor pulled out a legal briefing document that Dr. Müller had prepared specifically for my case. The first page alone listed 8 different jurisdictions that might have legal authority over Robert's compensation: Switzerland, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, the European Union, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations, and something called the Soviet Successor States Claims Tribunal. The primary challenge is establishing your legal identity across multiple decades and legal systems, Victor explained. You've lived under Soviet law, Ukrainian law, and American law. Your marriage was performed under Soviet jurisdiction, but you're now an American citizen claiming funds managed under Swiss law. The documentation requirements were staggering. I would need to provide my original Soviet birth certificate, Robert's birth certificate, our Soviet marriage certificate, proof of Robert's employment at Chernobyl, proof of his death, documentation of my immigration to America, evidence of my current American citizenship, and verification that I had never received any previous compensation. Some of these documents no longer exist, I said, scanning the list. The Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine has been through wars. How am I supposed to prove things that happened 37 years ago? Victor nodded grimly. This is where Dr. Muller's expertise becomes essential. He has relationships with archives in multiple countries, access to records that most people don't know exist. But the process takes time and costs money. The legal briefing outlined the expected timeline: 6 to 18 months for document verification, 3 to 6 months for legal review by multiple jurisdictions, and 2 to 4 months for final fund transfer. Even under the best circumstances, I was looking at nearly 2 years before receiving any money. What about costs? I asked. noting several references to substantial legal fees and administrative expenses. Victor showed me Dr. Muller's fee structure. The lawyer worked on a contingency basis, no fee, unless the claim was successful, but his percentage was 25% of the recovered funds. On an $11 million claim, that meant nearly $3 million in legal fees. I know it seems like a lot, Victor said, but Dr. Mueller has a 100% success rate with legitimate claims. Without his expertise, you could spend years navigating the bureaucracy and still fail to recover anything. The legal challenges went beyond simple document verification. The briefing outlined potential complications with current international sanctions against Russia, changes in Ukrainian law since their 2014 revolution, modifications to Swiss banking regulations, and evolving American tax law regarding foreign inheritance. There's also the question of currency, conversion, and tax liability, Victor continued. The original compensation was calculated in 1986 Soviet rubles, converted to American dollars, invested in multiple currencies, and now must be distributed to an American citizen. Each conversion point creates potential legal challenges. Dr. Muller's briefing included worst-case scenarios that made my head spin. What if the Ukrainian government claimed the compensation should revert to them as successors to Soviet obligations? What if Russia argued that compensation should be processed through their legal system? What if American tax authorities decided the funds constituted taxable income rather than inheritance? Has Dr. Mueller handled cases like mine before? Victor showed me a list of Dr. Mueller's previous clients' 37 families, who had successfully recovered Soviet-era compensation funds. The amounts ranged from $800,000 to $15 million, with recovery times varying from 8 months to 4 years. Each case is different, Victor explained, but Dr. Mueller has developed standard procedures for the most common complications. He maintains relationships with government officials in all relevant jurisdictions, and he has established protocols for expediting document verification. The legal briefing included letters of recommendation from previous clients, all expressing gratitude for Dr. Muller's work, but also acknowledging the stress and complexity of the recovery process. One client described the experience as emotionally exhausting but ultimately life-changing. What if we can't locate all the required documents? I asked. Victor showed me a section of the briefing that outlined alternative verification procedures. In cases where original documents were unavailable, Dr. Mueller could work with government archives to reconstruct records using secondary sources. The process was more expensive and time-consuming, but it was possible. Dr. Mueller has recovered compensation for families who had even fewer documents than you, Victor assured me. In one case, the only proof of marriage was testimony from surviving wedding guests. In another, employment records were reconstructed using retirement benefit files. The briefing included a detailed timeline for my specific case. Dr. Mueller had already begun preliminary research, identifying which documents were available and which would need to be reconstructed. His initial assessment suggested my case was challenging but viable with a projected success rate of 85%. What happens if the claim is rejected? Victor showed me the contingency plan. If the initial claim failed, Dr. Mueller would appeal through multiple legal channels at no additional cost. Only if all appeals were exhausted would the case be considered unsuccessful, a situation that had never occurred in his career handling Soviet compensation funds. There's one more complication, Victor said, his voice growing more serious. Dr. Mueller believes there may be other claimants to Robert's compensation. What do you mean, other claimants? Victor showed me a legal memo outlining the possibility that Soviet records might list additional beneficiaries for Robert's fund. In some cases, the government had designated secondary beneficiaries, parents, siblings, or even professional colleagues who might have legal standing to claim portions of the compensation. This is highly unusual, Victor emphasized, but Dr. Mueller wants to investigate thoroughly before filing your claim. It's better to identify potential conflicts early than to face challenges after the process has begun. The business card in my hands suddenly felt heavier, weighted with the complexity of international law and decades of bureaucratic complications, but it also represented hope, the first concrete step toward claiming what Robert had intended for his family's future. I waited until Sunday evening to call my children, when I knew they'd both be home from their weekend activities. The family photo album lay open beside the phone, showing pictures of Sarah and Michael at various stages of their childhood, school photos where their clothes were obviously second-hand, birthday parties with homemade cakes, Christmas mornings with modest gifts carefully wrapped. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the casual happiness of someone whose biggest worry was whether to order takeout for dinner. "Hi, Mom. How was your week?" "Sarah, I need to tell you something important, something that's going to be hard to believe." The tone of my voice must have alarmed her because she immediately became serious. "What's wrong? Are you sick? Do you need money?" Even now, at 47 with a successful career and her own family, Sarah's first instinct was to worry about my finances. "I'm not sick, honey, but I need you to sit down for this." I told her about Victor's visit, about the secret compensation fund, about the $11 million that had been waiting for us for 37 years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mom," Sarah finally said, her voice carefully controlled, "are you sure this isn't some kind of scam? Elderly people are targeted for financial fraud all the time." I thought the same thing initially, but Victor had documents, official Soviet records with your father's name on them. He had photographs from the plant, journal entries in your father's handwriting. But $11 million, Mom, that's an impossible amount of money. If Dad was entitled to that kind of compensation, why wouldn't we have known about it? I explained about the bureaucratic failures, the immigration complications, the letters that had been sent but never received. With each detail, I could hear Sarah's disbelief giving way to a complex mixture of hope and anger. "You mean all those years you worked 3 jobs? All the times we couldn't afford things other kids had? All the nights you went to bed hungry so we could eat all of that was unnecessary?" "It appears so." Sarah's voice cracked. "Oh, Mom, so sorry. I'm so angry I could scream. But this is going to change everything for you. You'll never have to worry about money again." When I called Michael, his reaction was more direct. "Someone owes us 37 years of back interest," he said after I'd finished explaining. "Not just financial interest on every opportunity we missed, every stress you endured, every time we felt like charity cases." Michael had always been the more intense of my 2 children, quick to anger when he perceived injustice. At 45, he was a successful contractor who had worked his way up from manual labor to owning his own business. He'd never forgotten the years of financial insecurity. "Do you remember Mrs. Henderson in 4th grade?" Michael asked. "She used to bring me lunch when she noticed I wasn't eating. I was so embarrassed, but I was also so hungry. And the whole time, there was $11 million sitting in a Swiss bank account." I remember all of it." "What about when Sarah needed glasses in 7th grade, and we had to wait 3 months until you could afford them? She failed to tests because she couldn't see the blackboard clearly." The memories hurt, but they also strengthened my resolve to pursue the compensation. This wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledging that our struggles had been unnecessary, that Robert's sacrifice had been intended to prevent exactly the kind of hardship we'd endured. "There's something else," I told both children during a 3-way call I arranged the next evening. "The lawyer handling the case wants to know if either of you ever received letters from a Swiss bank." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Actually, yes, about 7 years ago, I got a letter that claimed to be from some bank in Switzerland. It looked like one of those inheritance scams, so I threw it away." "I got one too," Michael admitted. "Same thing, it looked like fraud, so I didn't even read it completely." The realization that we'd been so close to discovering the truth years earlier was almost too much to bear. If either of my children had taken those letters seriously, if they'd called the phone number or contacted the law firm, our financial struggles could have ended in 2016. "We can't think about that now," Sarah said, ever the practical one. "What matters is what we do going forward." "What do you need from us, Mom?" I explained about Dr. Muller's documentation requirements, about the need to verify our family history and immigration records. Both children immediately offered to help, gather documents, contact government offices, and provide whatever assistance the legal process required. "I want to meet this Victor person," Michael said. "I want to see the documents myself. Make sure this is legitimate before you commit to anything. And I want to research this, Dr. Mueller," Sarah added. "International asset recovery lawyers could be legitimate, but they could also be sophisticated scammers. We need to verify his credentials independently." Their protectiveness touched me, but it also highlighted how much our family dynamics had been shaped by financial insecurity. Both of my children had developed careful, skeptical approaches to money, because they'd grown up watching me struggle with every financial decision. "There's something else we need to talk about," I said. "If this compensation comes through, it's going to change things for all of us. Not just my situation, but our relationships, our expectations, everything." Sarah understood immediately. "You're worried about how sudden wealth might affect our family. I've read about lottery winners who lose their families along with their money. I don't want that to happen to us." Michael's voice was firm. "Mom, you worked 3 jobs for decades to provide for us. You've earned every penny of this money, and more. If anyone tries to make you feel guilty about finally having financial security, they'll have to go through me first." "I agree," Sarah said. "But Mom's right to be concerned. We should probably all talk to counselors who specialize in sudden wealth transition. This is going to be a major life change, and we want to handle it well." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from tax implications to estate planning to the emotional impact of discovering that 37 years of struggle had been unnecessary. By the end, I felt supported but also overwhelmed by the complexity of what lay ahead. "I keep thinking about Dad," Sarah said as we prepared to end the call. "He died believing that we'd be taken care of, that his sacrifice would ensure our security. Instead, we spent decades struggling. But maybe now we can finally honor his memory the way he intended." "We're going to make sure this happens, Mom," Michael added. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, we're going to get you the compensation Dad wanted you to have." Dr. Mueller arrived at my home 3 weeks after my initial contact with his Geneva office, carrying a briefcase that looked more like a small suitcase, and speaking English with the precise diction of someone who had learned the language in courtrooms rather than classrooms. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 55, with the kind of energetic efficiency that suggested he was accustomed to handling complicated cases quickly. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, settling into my living room with the confidence of someone comfortable in any environment, "I have spent considerable time researching your husband's case, and I must tell you that what I've discovered is both encouraging and troubling." He opened his briefcase and withdrew Robert's work notebook, the original, not photocopies somehow obtained from Ukrainian government archives. The notebook was smaller than I'd imagined, a simple black composition book with Robert's name, written on the cover, in his careful handwriting. "Your husband was extraordinarily meticulous in documenting his concerns about reactor safety," Dr. Mueller explained, turning through pages covered with technical diagrams, mathematical calculations, and detailed observations. "These notes demonstrate that he understood the potential for disaster months before it occurred." The notebook revealed a side of Robert I'd never known. Page after page showed complex engineering calculations, safety assessments, and increasingly urgent warnings about specific reactor vulnerabilities. His handwriting grew more hurried as the entries approached April 1986, suggesting mounting pressure and concern. "This entry from March 15 is particularly significant," Dr. Mueller said, pointing to a page covered with radiation exposure calculations. "Your husband calculated the exact radiation levels that would be lethal to reactor operators under emergency conditions. He knew precisely what he was walking into that night." The calculation showed different exposure scenarios. 15 minutes in the reactor building would be survivable. 30 minutes would cause severe radiation sickness, and anything over an hour would be fatal. Below these calculations, Robert had written, "Manual cooling system operation requires minimum 90 minutes exposure. Unsurvivable but necessary." He knew he was going to die, I whispered. "More than that," Dr. Mueller continued. "He calculated exactly how long the team could work before radiation exposure became fatal, then planned the cooling system operation to fit within that time frame. He essentially designed his own death to maximize its effectiveness." Dr. Mueller showed me pages where Robert had sketched detailed diagrams of the reactor cooling system, marking specific valves and pumps that would need manual operation. He'd created step-by-step procedures for emergency cooling activation, timing each step to minimize radiation exposure while ensuring system effectiveness. "Your husband wasn't just a hero who stayed behind," Dr. Mueller explained. "He was the architect of the emergency response that prevented a much larger disaster. His technical planning made the difference between a regional catastrophe and a global one." The notebook contained something else I hadn't expected: detailed notes about the compensation fund. Robert had researched the fund's structure, its legal requirements, and the process for family claims. He'd even sketched organizational charts showing which Soviet ministries would be responsible for fund administration. "This is why your husband's compensation was the largest," Dr. Mueller said, pointing to Robert's analysis of fund criteria. He understood not just the technical aspects of reactor safety, but also the bureaucratic aspects of family compensation. He positioned himself to maximize both his technical contribution and his family's financial benefit. Dr. Mueller showed me Robert's calculations of compensation amounts based on different levels of contribution to the emergency response. He'd identified the actions that would qualify for maximum compensation and had volunteered for those specific duties during the crisis. "Your husband essentially engineered his own heroism to ensure your family's financial security," Dr. Mueller said. "This wasn't random bravery, it was calculated sacrifice with specific objectives." The notebook's final entries were the most emotionally difficult to read. Robert had written detailed instructions for how I should claim the compensation, which officials to contact, which documents would be required. He'd tried to anticipate every bureaucratic obstacle I might face. April 24th entry. "Hazel will need Victor's help navigating the compensation system. He has connections in the right ministries and understands the political sensitivities. Without guidance, she could be lost in bureaucracy for years." "That's exactly what happened," I said. "Victor tried to help, but the system was too complex." Double quotes. Dr. Mueller nodded. "Your husband understood the system's complexity, but he underestimated its capacity for complete failure. He assumed bureaucratic delay, not bureaucratic collapse." Dr. Mueller had also obtained Robert's personnel file from the plant, revealing performance evaluations that consistently rated him as the facility's most knowledgeable reactor engineer. His supervisors had repeatedly recommended him for advanced training and leadership positions. "Your husband was being groomed for senior management," Dr. Mueller explained. "He had been selected for a special program that would have made him one of the Soviet Union's top nuclear experts." The compensation fund reflected not just his sacrifice, but also his potential value to the nuclear program. The personnel file contained letters of recommendation describing Robert as exceptionally gifted in understanding complex reactor systems and capable of innovations that could advance Soviet nuclear technology significantly. "The government wasn't just compensating your family for his death," Dr. Mueller continued. "They were compensating for the loss of someone who could have contributed decades of expertise to nuclear safety advancement." Dr. Mueller showed me correspondence between plant management and Moscow officials discussing Robert's potential promotion to chief engineer at a new reactor facility being planned for 1987. The position would have doubled his salary and provided housing in a prestigious Moscow suburb. "Your husband gave up not just his life, but also a career trajectory that would have provided substantial financial security for your family through conventional means." The compensation recognized both sacrifices. The investigation had also uncovered something unexpected. Robert had been working on safety improvements that could have prevented the Chernobyl disaster entirely. His notebook contained designs for modified cooling systems that would have made the reactor inherently safer. "If your husband had lived, if his safety modifications had been implemented, Chernobyl might never have happened," Dr. Mueller said. The compensation fund recognized that his death represented the loss of knowledge that could have prevented future disasters. Dr. Mueller closed the notebook and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Whitaker, your husband's case is unique in the history of nuclear accident compensation. His technical contribution, his calculated sacrifice, and his systematic approach to ensuring your family's security create an exceptionally strong legal claim." What does this mean for the compensation process? It means we have overwhelming evidence to support your claim, but it also means your case will receive intense scrutiny from multiple governments. Everyone involved will want to ensure the compensation process is handled properly. The investigation had revealed not just Robert's heroism, but the sophisticated planning that had gone into his final decisions. He hadn't just died saving others, he'd engineered his death to maximize both its immediate impact and its long-term benefit to his family. Dr. Mueller reached into his briefcase one final time and withdrew a document that made my heart stop. An official death certificate, but not the simplified version I'd received in 1986. This was the complete medical and technical report, stamped with classifications I'd never seen before, detailing exactly how and why my husband had died. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dr. Mueller said gently, "I believe you deserve to know the complete truth about your husband's final hours. But I must warn you, this information is more complex and difficult than what you were told 37 years ago. The death certificate was written in both Russian and English, filled with medical terminology and radiation exposure measurements that painted a precise picture of Robert's final day. According to the report, he had not died instantly in the explosion, as I'd been told. He had lived for 14 hours after his initial radiation exposure, conscious and directing emergency operations until the very end. Your husband led the manual cooling operation for 6 hours, Dr. Mueller explained, reading from the technical section. During this time, he coordinated the efforts of 12 other men, ensuring that each person's radiation exposure was minimized while maintaining system effectiveness. The report revealed that Robert had been the last person to leave the reactor building, staying behind to verify that the cooling systems would continue operating without manual intervention. By the time he emerged, his radiation exposure was far beyond lethal levels. He was taken to a special medical facility in Kiev, Dr. Mueller continued, where he spent his final 8 hours providing detailed technical debriefs to Soviet nuclear experts. Even while dying, he was teaching others how to prevent similar disasters. I stared at the death certificate, trying to process this new information. He was conscious. He was able to speak. According to medical records, yes. He provided detailed, technical reports, answered questions about reactor system modifications, and gave specific instructions for improving emergency response procedures. His final hours contributed to nuclear safety improvements that are still used today. Dr. Mueller showed me transcripts of Robert's final interviews, pages of technical discussions about reactor design, emergency protocols, and safety system improvements. Even facing death, Robert had remained focused on preventing future disasters. There's something else, Dr. Mueller said, his voice becoming even more gentle. Your husband specifically asked to speak with Soviet compensation officials during his final hours. He wanted to ensure that the fund would be properly administered and that you would receive the support you needed. The medical records included notes from these conversations, Robert's specific instructions about how the compensation should be managed, his concerns about bureaucratic delays, and his detailed descriptions of our family's financial needs. He told them about your teaching background, about the children's educational needs, about your lack of extended family support in America. He provided a complete profile of your family's situation to ensure the compensation would be structured appropriately. Dr. Mueller showed me Robert's handwritten statement, dictated to a Soviet official during his final hours. My wife Hazel is intelligent and capable, but she will be alone in a foreign country with 2 children. The compensation must be protected from bureaucratic failures and managed to provide long-term security, not just immediate relief. He also made specific requests about how you should be contacted. Dr. Mueller continued. He asked that Viktor Petrov be assigned as family liaison, that you receive regular updates about the fund's status, and that additional support be provided if you encountered difficulties with the bureaucracy. The death certificate included a section I'd never seen before: Robert's official classification as Hero of the Soviet Union, First Class, along with detailed justification for this highest civilian honor. The justification described his technical leadership during the emergency, his voluntary assumption of lethal responsibilities, and his contribution to preventing a global catastrophe. Your husband's heroism was formally recognized at the highest levels of Soviet government, Dr. Mueller explained. This classification entitled your family to maximum compensation and ongoing government support. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Robert hadn't just died randomly during a nuclear accident. He had deliberately chosen the most dangerous role in the emergency response, knowing it would kill him, because he understood that his technical expertise was essential, and because he wanted to ensure maximum compensation for his family. He calculated his own death, I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. More accurately, he optimized his death, Dr. Mueller corrected. He chose to die in a way that would save the most lives and provide the most benefit to your family. It was the ultimate expression of both his professional expertise and his personal love. Dr. Mueller showed me the final page of the death certificate, Robert's last recorded words, spoken to a Soviet official just before he lost consciousness. Tell Hazel that everything I did was for our family's future. The money will come. Victor will help her understand. She must not blame herself for any of this. I had spent 37 years believing that Robert's death was a tragic accident that left us financially devastated. Now I understood that his death was a carefully planned sacrifice designed to ensure our financial security. The system had failed to deliver on his intentions, but his intentions had been thoroughly documented and legally protected. This changes how I think about everything, I said, looking at the official documents spread across my coffee table. Robert didn't just die heroically, he died strategically. Your husband was both hero and engineer. Dr. Mueller agreed. He approached his death the same way he approached complex technical problems, by analyzing all variables and choosing the solution that would produce the best possible outcome. The death certificate included one more detail that took my breath away. In the section describing Robert's final medical condition, a doctor had noted, patient expressed satisfaction that his technical analysis had been correct and that his family would be properly provided for. Patient died peacefully, believing his objectives had been accomplished. Robert had died thinking his plan had worked, believing that his sacrifice would result in immediate financial security for his family. He'd had no way of knowing that bureaucratic failures would leave us struggling in poverty for decades while his compensation grew untouched in a Swiss bank account. Mrs. Whitaker, Dr. Mueller said, carefully organizing the documents back into his briefcase, your husband's case represents one of the most sophisticated examples of calculated heroism in the history of nuclear accidents. His death was not just brave, it was brilliant. But we never received the compensation. We struggled for 37 years. That doesn't diminish your husband's planning or his love for your family. It simply means the system failed to honor his sacrifice. Our job now is to ensure that failure is corrected. Dr. Mueller stood to leave, but paused at the door. Your husband died believing he had solved two problems, simultaneously preventing a global nuclear disaster and ensuring his family's financial future. He succeeded completely at the first objective. It's time to fulfill the second. 3 months after Dr. Mueller's visit, I found myself sitting in the offices of the Swiss bank that had been managing Robert's compensation for 37 years. The building was exactly what I'd imagined: imposing stone architecture, hushed corridors, and an atmosphere of serious money, managed by serious people. In my hands were the notarized claim forms that officially recognized my right to the compensation fund. The process had been more complex than Dr. Mueller had initially suggested, but also more thorough than I'd expected. Every document had been verified through multiple sources, every claim cross-referenced against historical records, every detail confirmed by independent authorities. Mrs. Whitaker, said the bank representative, a precise woman named Ms. Hoffman who spoke English with only the slightest Swiss accent, we are pleased to inform you that your claim has been approved by all relevant authorities. After 37 years, we can finally honor your husband's wishes. Ms. Hoffman opened a thick folder containing the complete history of Robert's compensation fund. The documents showed every transaction, every investment decision, every attempt to locate our family over the decades. The bank had maintained meticulous records, treating the dormant fund with the same care they would give to any active account. The current value of your compensation is $11,734,892.47, Ms. Hoffman announced, showing me the final accounting statement. This includes the original $5 million compensation, 37 years of compound interest, and investment gains, minus management fees and search expenses. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing astronomical distances. I tried to imagine what $11 million actually meant in practical terms: how many years of rent it would cover, how many medical bills it would pay, how many opportunities it would create for my children and grandchildren. However, Ms. Hoffman continued, we must discuss the practical aspects of transferring such a large sum. For both legal and financial reasons, we recommend a structured distribution, rather than a single payment. Dr. Mueller had prepared me for this conversation. Transferring $11 million directly to my personal bank account would create immediate tax complications, currency conversion issues, and potential fraud vulnerabilities. The bank recommended a more sophisticated approach. We suggest establishing a family trust structure, Ms. Hoffman explained, showing me documents that Dr. Mueller had helped prepare. This would allow for gradual distribution, while providing tax advantages and protection from potential legal challenges. The proposed trust would pay me $200,000 immediately to address my most pressing needs, then distribute the remaining funds over a 10-year period. The structure would minimize tax liability while ensuring long-term financial security. What about my children? I asked. My husband intended for this compensation to benefit our entire family. Ms. Hoffman showed me additional trust documents that included provisions for Sarah and Michael. They would receive educational fund distributions for their children's college expenses, and they would inherit equal shares of any remaining trust assets upon my death. Dr. Mueller has structured this to honor your husband's original intentions while providing modern financial protections, Ms. Hoffman explained. The trust ensures that the compensation will benefit your family for generations, not just provide immediate relief. The bank had also prepared documents addressing the international complexity of the transfer. The compensation would be reported to American tax authorities, but the trust structure would minimize the tax burden. The funds would be converted from Swiss francs to American dollars at favorable institutional exchange rates. There is one additional matter, Ms. Hoffman said, reaching for another folder. The bank has received permission from Swiss financial authorities to waive all remaining management fees as an acknowledgement of the extended delay in processing your claim. This meant an additional $400,000 would remain in the fund rather than being deducted for administrative costs. The bank was essentially compensating me for their failure to locate our family sooner. We have also prepared a formal letter of apology from the bank's board of directors, Ms. Hoffman continued, handing me an elegant document on official letterhead. While this cannot restore the 37 years of financial hardship your family endured, it represents our institution's recognition of our responsibility in this matter. The apology letter was more meaningful than I'd expected. It acknowledged that the bank's search efforts, while extensive, had been insufficient to locate our family. It expressed genuine regret for our decades of unnecessary financial struggle. Most importantly, it committed the bank to improving their procedures for locating dormant asset beneficiaries. When will the funds be available? I asked. The initial distribution of $200,000 will be available within 48 hours, Ms. Hoffman replied. The trust establishment will take approximately 2 weeks, and regular distributions will begin the following month. Ms. Hoffman handed me a temporary bank card connected to an account containing the initial distribution. For the first time in my adult life, I held a piece of plastic that represented more money than I'd earned in the past 5 years combined. Mrs. Whitaker, Ms. Hoffman said as we concluded the meeting, I want you to know that your case has prompted significant changes in how we handle dormant assets. We are implementing new search procedures and international cooperation protocols to prevent similar situations in the future. The bank was creating what they called the Whitaker Protocol, enhanced procedures for locating beneficiaries of dormant assets, with particular attention to political refugees and immigration cases. Other Swiss banks were adopting similar measures. Your husband's sacrifice not only prevented a nuclear catastrophe, Ms. Hoffman concluded, but his compensation case is now helping ensure that other families won't face the same bureaucratic failures that your family endured. As I left the bank building, I carried more than just financial documents. I carried the weight of 37 years of struggle finally being acknowledged, of Robert's sacrifice finally being honored, and of a future that would be fundamentally different from anything I'd ever imagined. The notarized claim forms in my briefcase represented more than legal documents. They were proof that love and planning could survive decades of bureaucratic failure, that patience and persistence could overcome systemic obstacles, and that sometimes justice, though delayed, could still be achieved. Walking through the streets of Geneva, I thought about calling Sarah and Michael to share the news, but first, I wanted to sit quietly and absorb the reality that, after 37 years of financial worry, I would never have to count pennies at the grocery store again. The government rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official stamps that immediately signaled serious trouble. The envelope bore the seal of the Ukrainian Ministry of Justice, and my hands shook as I read the formal notification that my compensation claim had been denied, pending further investigation into potential conflicts with current Ukrainian law. Dr. Mueller's phone call came within an hour of the letter's delivery. His usual calm confidence was replaced by barely controlled frustration as he explained the political complications that had suddenly emerged around my case. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm afraid we're facing a challenge I didn't anticipate, he said, his voice tight with anger. The Ukrainian government is claiming that Soviet-era compensation funds should revert to Ukrainian control as part of their inheritance of Soviet assets and obligations. The rejection letter was 6 pages of legal terminology, but the essential argument was simple. Ukraine claimed that as the successor state to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, they had the right to review and potentially modify Soviet compensation decisions. They were demanding that my case be transferred from Swiss jurisdiction to Ukrainian courts. This is purely political, Dr. Mueller explained during an emergency meeting at his New York office. Ukraine is facing severe economic pressures due to their ongoing conflict with Russia. They're looking for any source of available funds, including compensation that was legally established decades ago. The timing was particularly unfortunate. Ukraine's recent military struggles had created desperate need for government revenue, and dormant Soviet-era funds represented potential resources that could be redirected to current national priorities. My compensation had become entangled in international politics completely unrelated to Robert's sacrifice. What does this mean for my claim? I asked, staring at the rejection letter that had arrived just weeks after the Swiss bank had approved my case. Dr. Mueller spread out additional documents he'd received from various government offices. 3 different countries are now claiming jurisdiction over your compensation. Ukraine wants to review all Soviet-era funds. Russia argues that nuclear accident compensation should be processed through their legal system, as inheritors of Soviet nuclear programs, and the European Union is investigating whether Swiss banks properly reported dormant assets to relevant authorities. Each jurisdiction was making different demands. Ukraine wanted the entire case transferred to Kiev for review under current Ukrainian law. Russia was claiming that compensation for Soviet nuclear workers should be processed through their pension system. The EU was demanding detailed accounting of all management fees and investment decisions over 37 years. Are they allowed to do this? Can they just take away compensation that was legally established? Dr. Mueller's expression was grim. International law regarding successor states and dormant assets is complex and often contradictory. Each country has legitimate arguments, but they also have political motivations that have nothing to do with your family's rights. The Ukrainian rejection letter included specific demands that seemed designed to make my claim impossible to pursue. They wanted me to appear in person at government offices in Kiev, provide documents that had been destroyed during various conflicts, and submit to interviews with officials who would determine whether my family deserved the compensation under current Ukrainian values. This is harassment, Dr. Mueller said bluntly. They're hoping that an elderly American woman won't have the resources or determination to fight their bureaucracy. They're counting on you to give up and let them keep the money. The political complications extended beyond simple jurisdiction disputes. Dr. Mueller showed me news articles about Ukrainian investigations into Swiss banking practices, Russian claims to Soviet nuclear assets, and EU regulations about reporting dormant accounts. My personal compensation had become a symbol in larger international conflicts. The Swiss bank is standing firm, Dr. Mueller assured me. They've issued a formal statement that your claim was properly verified and approved under Swiss law. They're refusing to transfer the funds to any government without a final court order from an appropriate international tribunal. This meant the money would remain frozen while various governments argued about jurisdiction. The compensation that had been waiting 37 years for me to claim was now waiting for international lawyers and politicians to resolve their disputes. How long could this take? Dr. Mueller's answer was discouraging. International jurisdiction disputes can take years to resolve. We're dealing with 3 different legal systems, complex treaties about successor state obligations, and ongoing political conflicts that make cooperation difficult. Victor, who had remained supportive throughout the process, was outraged by the developments. These governments didn't care about your family for 37 years, he said during a phone call from Ukraine. Now that someone else has done the work to verify your claim, they suddenly want to control the money. The rejection letter had also created practical problems beyond legal complications. The Swiss bank had frozen my account pending resolution of the jurisdiction dispute. The initial $200,000 distribution I'd been expecting was now unavailable, leaving me in the same financial situation I'd been in before learning about the compensation. What are our options? I asked Dr. Mueller. He outlined a multi-front legal strategy that would be expensive and time-consuming. We could challenge Ukraine's jurisdiction claim in international court, appeal to Swiss authorities to resist government pressure, petition the EU to expedite their investigation, and lobby American officials to support my claim through diplomatic channels. Each approach will require significant legal fees, Dr. Mueller warned. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in costs, with no guarantee of success. The irony was crushing. After 37 years of poverty, I was being offered the choice between giving up my compensation or spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. I didn't have to fight for money that was legally mine. There is one other option, Dr. Mueller said quietly. We could negotiate a settlement with the Ukrainian government. They might agree to release your compensation in exchange for a substantial percentage going to Ukrainian government programs. How substantial? Potentially 50% or more. They're in a strong negotiating position because they know you can't afford a prolonged legal battle. I stared at the rejection letter, feeling the weight of decades of financial struggle, combined with the frustration of bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to defeat elderly claimants. After coming so close to justice, I was faced with the possibility that political considerations would once again deny my family the compensation Robert had died to secure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Anya, the widow of Mikhail Petrov, who had used her compensation to build the International Nuclear Safety Institute. She had been following my case through Victor and had mobilized a coalition of Chernobyl families to challenge the Ukrainian government's interference. Mrs. Whitaker, Dr. Petrovchin said during a video call that included representatives from 7 other Chernobyl families, your case threatens the legal foundation of all our compensation. If Ukraine can retroactively claim jurisdiction over your funds, they can challenge everyone's compensation. The coalition had hired their own international legal team to file a formal challenge to Ukraine's jurisdiction claim. More importantly, they had leveraged their collective influence with international nuclear safety organizations to apply political pressure on the Ukrainian government. We have spent 37 years building institutions and programs that honor our husband's sacrifices, explained Maria Kozlov, whose husband had died alongside Robert. We will not allow political opportunism to undermine the legal framework that protects all Chernobyl families. Dr. Mueller called with extraordinary news just 2 weeks after the coalition's intervention. Mrs. Whitaker, I need you to sit down. The European Union has issued a formal ruling that Ukrainian claims to your compensation violate international treaties about successor state obligations. The EU ruling was based on technical legal arguments about the nature of individually designated compensation versus general state assets. Because Robert's compensation had been specifically designated for our family by name, it could not be retroactively claimed as a general Ukrainian state asset. More importantly, Dr. Mueller continued, the Swiss Banking Authority has issued a precedent-setting ruling that protects dormant compensation funds from political interference by successor states. Your case is now establishing international law that will protect other families in similar situations. The legal victory had come through a combination of technical arguments and political pressure. The coalition of Chernobyl families had demonstrated that allowing Ukraine to interfere with my compensation would threaten the security of millions of dollars in similar funds. International nuclear organizations had argued that compensation security was essential for maintaining safety standards. The Ukrainian government has formally withdrawn their objection to your claim, Dr. Mueller announced. They've also agreed to expedite any future Chernobyl compensation cases to prevent similar delays. The Swiss bank moved quickly to finalize my compensation once the legal obstacles were removed. Within 3 days of Ukraine's withdrawal, I received the bank check for $5 million, the full amount that had been held up during the jurisdiction dispute, plus additional interest that had accumulated during the legal challenge. The check itself was surprisingly modest-looking for such an enormous amount of a simple piece of paper with my name and an amount that represented more money than I had ever imagined possessing. But it was also much more than a financial instrument. It was proof that Robert's sacrifice had finally been properly recognized and honored. Mrs. Whitaker, said Ms. Hoffman during our final meeting at the Swiss bank, your case has established important legal precedents that will protect other families from similar bureaucratic failures. The Whitaker Protocol is now being adopted by banks across Europe. The successful legal challenge had created binding international precedents about dormant asset protection, successor state limitations, and individual compensation rights. Legal experts were calling it a landmark case in international banking law. Victor was present for the final transfer, tears in his eyes as he watched me sign the documents that would complete Robert's 37-year-old plan for our family's security. Your husband would be proud, he said simply, not just of the money, but of the legal protections your case has created for other families. The emotional impact of finally receiving the compensation was more complex than I had anticipated. Relief was mixed with grief for the decades of struggle that could have been avoided. Joy was tempered by anger at the bureaucratic failures that had caused so much unnecessary hardship. But there was also profound satisfaction in knowing that Robert's careful planning had ultimately succeeded. His technical expertise had prevented a global disaster. His strategic approach to compensation had ensured our family's financial security, and now, his case was protecting other families from similar bureaucratic failures. Dr. Mueller presented me with copies of all the legal documents from my case, bound in leather volumes that would serve as a record of the lengthy process. Your determination to pursue this claim has changed international law, he said. Other families facing similar situations will benefit from the precedents your case established. The total compensation, including interest and legal settlement, came to $12.3 million. The trust structure Dr. Mueller had established would provide me with a monthly income larger than my previous annual salary, while preserving the majority of the funds for my children and grandchildren. What will you do first? Victor asked. As we left the bank building, I thought about the question as we walked through Geneva's financial district, passing buildings where similar cases were probably being processed for other families. I'm going to buy a plane ticket to visit my grandchildren, I said. And then I'm going to make sure other families don't have to wait 37 years for justice. The money was life-changing, but the knowledge that Robert's planning had finally succeeded was even more meaningful. After nearly 4 decades, his sacrifice had achieved both of its intended objectives, preventing a global catastrophe and securing his family's future. As I held the bank documentation that officially transferred Robert's compensation to our family, I felt not just financial relief but emotional completion. The love he had expressed through his calculated sacrifice had finally been translated into the security he had intended to provide. Justice had been delayed by 37 years, but it had not been denied. Robert's plan had worked, his sacrifice had been honored, and his family would finally benefit from the future he had died to secure. 6 months after receiving Robert's compensation, I stood in the newly dedicated memorial garden at the International Nuclear Safety Institute, watching the unveiling of a bronze plaque that bore my husband's name alongside the 30 other Chernobyl heroes. The memorial plaque was small but beautifully crafted, engraved with Robert's words from his final journal entry: "Nuclear energy must serve humanity safely, or not at all." The memorial garden was my first major gift using Robert's compensation, but it was far from my last. Working with Dr. Petrov-Chun and the Coalition of Chernobyl Families, I had established the Robert Whitaker Foundation for Nuclear Safety Education, funding scholarships for engineering students who committed to careers in reactor safety. Your husband would be amazed to see what his sacrifice has accomplished, Dr. Petrov-Chun said as we watched the dedication ceremony. Not just preventing the disaster at Chernobyl, but inspiring a new generation of safety engineers. The Foundation's first class of scholarship recipients included 12 students from 6 different countries, all studying nuclear engineering with specializations in safety systems and emergency response. Each student had written essays about Robert's technical contributions to the Chernobyl response, ensuring that his expertise would be studied and built upon by future engineers. Sarah and Michael had joined me for the memorial dedication, bringing my 4 grandchildren to see their grandfather honored alongside his colleagues. At ages 8 through 15, the grandchildren were old enough to understand the significance of the ceremony and the family history they were inheriting. "Grandpa was a hero," my youngest granddaughter, Emma, had said as we examined the memorial plaque together. "But he was also really smart about math and science, like you taught us to be." The financial transformation of our family had been dramatic, but carefully managed through the trust structure Dr. Mueller had established. Rather than sudden wealth-creating problems, the gradual distribution had allowed us to adapt to our new circumstances while maintaining our family values. I had purchased a modest but comfortable home in a neighborhood where I felt safe and welcomed, replacing the cramped apartment where I'd spent decades worrying about rent. The house had space for visiting family members and a large kitchen where I could host the holiday gatherings I'd never been able to afford before. More importantly, I had been able to provide educational opportunities for my grandchildren that I'd never been able to offer my own children. College funds were established for each grandchild, along with support for special programs in science and engineering that honored Robert's technical legacy. "The money is wonderful," I had told Sarah during one of our regular family dinners, But what means the most is knowing that Robert's planning finally worked. He died believing we would be provided for, and 37 years later, we finally are. The compensation had also allowed me to help other Chernobyl families who were still fighting bureaucratic battles for recognition and support. Through the foundation, I had funded legal assistance for 3 families whose compensation claims were trapped in similar jurisdictional disputes. Victor had become a regular visitor, spending his remaining months helping me establish the foundation and document the complete history of the Chernobyl compensation program. His health was declining, but his satisfaction in finally fulfilling his promise to Robert was evident in everything he did. "I have carried guilt about your family's struggle for 37 years, Victor had told me during his last visit. Seeing you finally receive what Robert intended, seeing the foundation honor his memory, seeing your family secure, this allows me to rest peacefully." Victor passed away 3 months after the memorial dedication, but not before seeing the foundation's second scholarship class established and the completion of a comprehensive archive documenting the stories of all 31 Chernobyl heroes and their families. The archive had become an important resource for researchers studying nuclear accident response and compensation systems. Universities around the world were using our documentation to teach courses about technical heroism, calculated sacrifice, and the intersection of engineering expertise with moral courage. Robert's story is being taught in nuclear engineering programs in 12 countries, Dr. Petrovchin had informed me during our quarterly foundation meeting. His technical analysis of the emergency response is considered essential reading for reactor safety specialists. The foundation had also funded a documentary film about the Chernobyl heroes, focusing on the families they left behind and the long-term impact of their sacrifices. The film had been selected for international film festivals and was being used as an educational tool by nuclear safety organizations. Standing in the memorial garden, surrounded by family and fellow survivors, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love finally fulfilled. Robert's sacrifice had been motivated by 2 goals: preventing a global disaster and providing for his family's future. Both objectives had now been fully achieved. The bronze plaque caught the afternoon sunlight, making Robert's name shine alongside his colleagues' names. Below the list of heroes, an inscription read, "They chose to stay so others could live. Their families chose to remember so others could learn." My transformation from struggling widow to foundation director had been profound, but it felt like a natural evolution rather than a dramatic change. The same determination that had sustained me through 37 years of financial hardship now drove my efforts to honor Robert's memory and help other families. "What's next for the foundation?" Sarah asked as we prepared to leave the memorial garden. I looked at the bronze plaque one more time, thinking about Robert's words in his final journal entries and his hope that nuclear energy could serve humanity safely. "We're going to make sure no other families have to wait 37 years for justice," I said, "and we're going to train engineers who understand that technical expertise comes with moral responsibility." The memorial garden would remain as a permanent reminder of Robert's sacrifice, but the foundation would ensure that his legacy continued to grow through education, research, and support for families affected by nuclear accidents. As we walked away from the memorial, I carried with me not just the satisfaction of financial security, but the deeper fulfillment of knowing that love, when combined with determination, could overcome any obstacle. Robert's sacrifice had finally achieved everything he had intended, and his memory would continue to inspire future generations of engineers committed to serving humanity safely. The money had changed our circumstances, but the love that motivated Robert's sacrifice continued to shape everything we did with the opportunities his gift had provided.